Imagine that you're a piano student at the Paris Conservatoire. It's June, and you are about to sight read in front of a waiting audience. At stake is a prize in the end-of-the-year competition, of which sight reading, in French, lecture à vue or déchiffrage, is a major component. Waiting to be summoned to the stage, you know your training has prepared you, but the anxiety over the lack of control of the situation has settled in. You hear your name called. You sit at the piano and look at the score in front of you. It is handwritten by a copyist, while the jury holds the composer's autograph. You gather your thoughts, hoping for smooth cooperation between mind and body. Déchiffrage, after all, relies on a seamless coordination of visual, oral, haptic, and kinesthetic modes of perception. You see full octave chords and feel your hand stretch. You notice the ottava bracket and immediately adjust your position on the bench, ready to lean into the instrument's treble register. You are relieved that this won't be a horse race. Molto moderato reads the tempo marking. Très modéré bellows a familiar voice, that of Gabriel Fauré, the Conservatoire director. What you are about to play is technically a performance of this new and mysterious piece, but not the kind of performance that you prepared for your earlier memorized exam. Decisions are not premeditated, but decided on the spot. A slow read is impossible, which makes analysis impossible. No numerals to identify chord progressions, no numbers to guide your fingers, no voice-leading reductions to streamline texture. What you are about to do is akin to, but not quite, improvisation. You have all the material in front of you, and while the next 2 minutes, or 1 or 3, you do not know, might feel like a flight of fancy, the jury is looking for exactitude. They, unlike you, have had the privilege of slow reading. An experienced sight reader, you know to look ahead. Your eyes pull your hands forward, so what you are reading does not line up with what your hands are playing. The sounds you create are at once familiar and foreign. Ninth chords give way to something stranger, potentially wrong, but there is no time to reflect or correct. After measure 4, you notice that your right hand is toying with musical time. The broad sense of 3 implied by the 9/8 meter gives way to a pattern of 6+3. After your brief visit in the treble register, you reach the reprise and hear a variant of the opening theme. A jarring progression of triads emerges from the piano, causing your hands to overlap. A, G flat, E flat, E minor. You complete the final measure, relieved to hear a dissonance-free C major sonority. You're done. You executed this musical work, but you also just heard it for the first time. Not so the jury, critics, and audience, who had already listened to 30 competitors crawl through it before you. A few people in the hall applaud, but it is unclear for whom it is intended, you or the composition. The piece is by Nadia Boulanger, the date is June 27th, 1914, the venue is the old hall of the Conservatoire on the Rue Bergère, and chances are you were one of these 13 prize-winning women. These are the details which, as historians of musical performance, we usually begin with when we set out to establish a historical record, or what Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht would call the meaning effects of history. Meaning effects are not affective and immediate, but rather metaphysical, inasmuch as they continue to presuppose that communication is predominantly about meaning, about something spiritual that is carried by and needs to be identified beneath the purely material surfaces of the material. Gumbrecht's anti-hermeneutic alternative, presence, does not so much replace as oscillate with meaning. Presence calls attention to an object's pre-conceptual thingness, that is, before its subjection to hermeneutic dissection. So what, if anything, does Boulanger's pièce de déchiffrage present to us now? A slower reading than the one with which I opened would neuter it of its ontological function, as a text to be deciphered in real time. It would, in effect, make it something it was never meant to be, a musical work. Hence the paradox of the research I am undertaking. How do you read sight reading critically? My paper takes cues from this fleeting musical act, not just to understand sight reading as a phenomenological moment, but also to empathize with historical actors for whom good déchiffrage meant a career in music. In the first part, I share some of my thinking about how to translate sight reading into words. The second part examines the practice from the view of the 19th century Conservatoire student, bringing together curricular records, press reviews, and the rather unwieldy corpus of handwritten sight reading pieces, mostly housed at the Archives Nationales in Paris. My main historical argument is that French critical attention to public déchiffrage increased after 1850, when, as Dana Gooley has recently explained, piano improvisation was on the decline. Public sight reading thus filled the void of performative immediacy in the pianistic public sphere. The increased premium on deciphering spawned a musical economy that tasked composers with producing preparatory sight-reading pieces, destined for single use. This pianistic corpus simulated the contours of musical works, whose ontological status rested in their repeatability through memorized performance, but differs in that they were rarely intended for reuse. Set against the gendered climate of the 19th century pianistic scene, as described by Catherine Ellis, Laura Hamer, Florence Launay, Jan Pasler, and others, this paper makes the case that sight-reading ability was a crucial pipeline from conservatoire to career. Reading sight-reading critically requires a mode of inquiry beyond meaning effects of scores. What if, instead of jumping to the rehearsed and premeditated premiere of a work, we dwell on that first encounter between player and unplayed work? What kind of reading is sight reading anyway? In his Phenomenology of Reading, Georges Poulet recounts a metaphysical bond, what we might call a flow state, that occurs when reader meets text. Such is the initial phenomenon produced whenever I take up a book and begin to read it. At the precise moment that I see, surging out of the object I hold open before me, a quantity of significations which my mind grasps, I realize that what I hold in my hands is no longer just an object, or even simply a living thing. I am aware of a rational being, of a consciousness, the consciousness of another. One can easily substitute book for score. In fact, piano sight reading probably serves as a better case for Poulet's metaphysics. For Poulet, the hands do not simply hold the text up to the eyes, but collaborate in bringing it to life. Moreover, reading is necessarily communal, as it connects Poulet's physical body with the consciousness of others. The act of initial reading, in other words, is the whole point. If rereading helps uncover meaning beyond the text, be it structural or hermeneutic, the initial phenomenon of sight reading celebrates the surface. In their introduction to surface reading, Stephen Best and Sharon Marcus juxtapose symptomatic reading, or the quest for meaning beyond the printed page, with surface reading, or the process of skimming, perusing, or what musicologist Emily Green has recently dubbed desultory reading. Reductions, rehearsals, poetics, contexts, all in one form or another, ask that we take a musical event and slow it down. Sight reading, it follows, cannot be symptomatic, as its objective is to decipher gestures that the body reproduces in real time. A surface is what insists on being looked at rather than what we must train ourselves to look through. Sight readers might relate. To sight read well is to surf on top of the text, resisting the urge to stop and go deeper. In a sense, sight reading is not reading at all, since a good sight reader is always one step ahead of the notated score. Like solfège, basso continuo, and partimento, déchiffrage is an art of anticipation, testing a player's abilities to predict. An analysis of the sight reading piece should take into account this initial mode of perception. The materialities of sight reading, the eye movements, the bodily contortions, the sudden changes in texture and register, constitute what Best and Marcus would call a critical description of the sight reading piece. Much like an etude's structural logic is determined by the physiological challenge it poses to the player. But there is a historical argument here as well. Without déchiffrage as the central inquiry, there would be little reason to revisit Boulanger's 1914 piano piece and its gendered critical reception. There would also be little reason to account for the musical community of professional sight readers, which constituted a sizable female workforce in France. As the rest of this paper will show, sight reading was a determining skill in many musicians' lives post-conservatoire. Diana Ligeti, a current sight-reading professor at the Conservatoire, writes that sight-reading, quote, is a specialty of French musical education. Déchiffrage was part of the Conservatoire's examination scheme since its inception, but the nature of what was meant by sight reading, how it was tested, and how it was taught changed continuously. Crucially, sight reading was not a distinct program of study. For the end-of-the-year exams, students played a prepared morceau de concours and an unprepared morceau de déchiffrage, and the juries chose prizes based on an aggregate score of the two. It was only in 1919 that the pianist Jacques Février won the Conservatoire's first médaille de lecture à vue. Professorships in piano déchiffrage per se were not created until the mid-20th century, but as Laura Hamer has noted, these posts, largely staffed by overqualified female musicians like Jean Leleu, were considered inferior or even demeaning as compared to the more prestigious professorships in harmony, counterpoint, or composition. Throughout the 19th century, keyboardists took courses in accompagnement, which encompassed ear training, solfège, as well as continuo realization or basse donnée. Archival collecting of sight-reading materials only began in the 1820s, coinciding with Luigi Cherubini's directorship from 1822 to 1842. An early example of an archived morceau de déchiffrage is by Cherubini for solo bassoon and continuo. Cherubini saw the archival, or perhaps economical, potential of saving sight-reading materials, as evidenced by the number of times his bassoon piece was subsequently reused in future exams. The recycling of morceaux de déchiffrage was common until the 1860s, and the gendered segregation of classes and exams did not seem to play a role in which pieces were reused. Scores exist in two forms: the handwritten composer's copy used by the jury and replete with last-minute cuts and changes, and the copyist's edition read by the student. Cherubini's works aside, most of the pieces used between 1830 and 1860 were nameless and were used for both female and male exams. The musical press largely ignored the end-of-the-year exams in the first half of the century, but this changed in 1860 when Le Ménestrel published a long essay on the sight-reading component of the annual exam. At issue was the nebulous way that déchiffrage was judged. Writing in defense of great readers but bad players, Jacques-Léopold Hugel argued for a more transparent evaluation process. In particular, Hugel voiced frustration at how unevenly the jury judged the two skills, memorized performance and sight reading, leading him to conclude that the sight reading exam, quote, has no real point. Indeed, critics were more likely to pan mediocre reading than mediocre playing, reducing their judgments to single adjectives. At one end of the spectrum, son défaillance, nuancé, and esquisse de musicalité appear as aesthetic judgments. But these single words or phrases, floating on the printed page below students' names, are veiled in ambiguity. What was exquisite? The interpretation or the ability? On the other end of the spectrum, hésitant, plat, and inexistant clearly pass judgment on a student's skill, or lack thereof. Between the gendered segregation of the exams and the male critics, the students who had the most to lose were, unsurprisingly, women. Many female students relied on excellent reading not just as a means to an end, but as a career path in itself. Among the more successful was Eugénie Carriat. Born in 1863, Carriat was the daughter of Étienne Carriat, the journalist and photographer best known for his portraits of Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Berlioz, Rossini, and others. Eugénie excelled in piano from an early age, and was admitted to the Conservatoire in 1877, aged 14. She studied piano with Delaborde and enrolled in female-only classes taught by female professors. These included keyboard studies with Tarpé and individual solfège with Ardouin, a class in which Carriat won first prize in 1880 and 1882. After graduating in 1884, Carriat taught sight reading from her home in Paris. Ads for her class appeared in many newspapers, suggesting that there was a market for independent sight reading pedagogy outside the Conservatoire. The sight-reading pieces themselves were rarely reviewed in the press. While a market emerged in the 1880s to publish former sight-reading pieces, most never saw the light of day outside the Conservatoire archive. Others, like Maurice Ravel's 1913 Morceaux de déchiffrage, were republished and renamed, thus taking on a new identity as repeatable musical works. It was a different case with Nadia Boulanger, who was commissioned to write two sight-reading pieces in 1914. One for the female advanced class, which we heard earlier, and one for the male preparatory class. Neither was published, but Boulanger would expand the preparatory piece into the third of her trois pièces pour piano. Reviewing the 1914 piano exams, Raymond Bouillet panned Boulanger's female competition piece in a lengthy aside. Within this long day filled with mechanical playing, shall we mention the hour devoted to sight reading, which one might hope provided some necessary bloodletting? It seems, at least, that it was precisely that cruel instinct that guided the composer who wrote the sight reading piece. Between 5 and 6 o'clock, 31 players in a row had to sight read a long page that was indecipherable, and therefore very feminine, written by Mademoiselle Nadia Boulanger. A spiderweb perfidiously woven of ninths, in which most of these competitors got tangled to no evident purpose. A very moderate tempo, announced the president, but difficulties arose during 2 long minutes that felt like a century, in maneuvering amidst these new banalities of premeditated dissonance. It is unclear to me where Bouillet's misogyny is directed: at the text, the performers, the author, or all three. Did he find the piece feminine because of its web-like indecipherability, because 31 women had just premiered the work, or because he saw Boulanger's name on the score? There is a lot more going on in Bouillet's review than a nasty woman critique of Boulanger. What is fascinating about this review is its attunement to perception. Bouillet sight reads the room, making surface-level remarks connecting his perception of the music with his experience of being in the moment. Bouillet keeps looking at his watch, noting his exasperation of a long day of auditing exams, the precise time at which the sight-reading portion occurred, and the verbal announcement of tempo. Gradually, his sense of clock time gets warped with every rehearing of Boulanger's piece. Like other critics who were there, he portrays an anxiety-ridden space. He is empathetic with the factory-like conditions to which both students and jury were subjected. The 31 students had each already performed Alexander Glazunov's 16-minute variations in F-sharp minor, that year's morceau de concours. That's 8 hours of Glazunov, for those counting. But the critic also betrayed his own struggle with objectively judging Boulanger's piece while hearing it played at sight over and over. The music's meaning effects, then, were bound to the presence effects of the competition. Reacting to the networks of communication in the hall between reader, text, jury, and audience, the critic blamed Boulanger for all of it: the long day, the tired ears, the wrong notes, the sudden stops, and the backstage sobs. The author of the sight-reading text is also the engineer of the sight-reading event, hiccups and all. The curious historical moment that was the public sight-reading exam involved several overlapping agents: the student, who had never seen the piece; the jury, who has had prior access to the musical text; the composer, who had the power to either accommodate or punish the sight-reading students; and the critics, whose job it was to judge sight-reading in prose. Georges Poulet would include the text itself, which for him possessed sentient qualities when read. This paper has begun to probe sight reading as both a phenomenological moment and a historic practice. While it could spark communal joy, sight reading could also be an anxiety-inducing act. For many Conservatoire students, bad sight reading was not only embarrassing, but also a referendum on their career prospects. Good readers made a career of it. In their way was a morceau de déchiffrage, a composition whose purpose was to be read and subsequently silenced, as its repeated hearing would render it useless. At mid-century, when improvisation declined in prestige, sight reading remained a fixture of French pianistic training. But the two activities are not dissimilar. Like improvisation, sight reading throws both player and audience into a balancing act of presence and prediction. Indeed, this affinity only grows when we begin to apply the language of critical improvisation studies. If improvisation, to philosopher Gary Peters, has always already happened, then sight reading, happening only once, should prove irresistible.